Prince Andrew was totally different. He could fly off the handle at the smallest thing. He would be abusive. He would shout. He would swear. So we had a particular issue with Prince Andrew.
Whispers, once confined to private corridors, have finally exploded into the open, dragging decades of carefully hidden chaos into the light. At exclusive parties where royalty mingled with the elite, witnesses say Prince Andrew's behaviour wasn't just inappropriate, it was shocking, relentless, and painfully embarrassing, even for those who tried to defend him. From unsettling demands to moments that left entire rooms frozen in disbelief, his long trail of misconduct can no longer be buried. But what really happened at these parties, and why are insiders finally breaking their silence after all these years? The prince, who never seemed to understand the word no, began like so many stories about him do, with something that looked harmless at first glance. 72 teddy bears were positioned with military precision across his bed, deep inside Buckingham Palace. Anyone else might have laughed at the sight, but the staff didn't dare. They had been handed a laminated photograph showing the exact angle, order, and placement for each bear. One bear slightly out of line, and the quiet corridors would erupt with his angry shouts. Servants learned to follow the pattern perfectly, treating the bears as ceremonial guards rather than childhood relics. It was a glimpse into a mind that demanded the world bend to its comfort. But this behaviour didn't appear overnight. It had been forming for years, long before adulthood. Granted titles and privileges in the late 1970s while still a teenager, whispers about Andrew's oddities began circulating among those who encountered him. One writer described a strange night at a country house party. Several young women were asleep in their rooms. The house was quiet and dark, when suddenly at 2 a.m, the door swung open. There stood Prince Andrew, claiming a ghost had frightened him and insisting he needed to share their bed. They threw him out instantly. It was foolish, intrusive, and revealing. Even at 17, Prince Andrew moved through the world as if everyone else would simply accept whatever he wanted. Another memory surfaced from a different gathering. One morning, a young woman, barely awake, brushing her teeth in her ensuite bathroom, watched as Prince Andrew strolled straight in, no knock. Instead of apologising, he launched into an impromptu lecture on proper brushing technique, as if barging into a private space gave him authority to correct her. The moment was not quirky, it was unsettling, a harsh reminder that boundaries mattered only when convenient for him. These stories drifted through the years like scattered warnings, small signs of a pattern that would only grow stronger with age. Those who repeatedly crossed paths with Prince Andrew said the same thing. He acted as if women existed solely to entertain him, react to him, and fit into his world without question. His humour often came wrapped in thinly veiled disrespect, and his attention demanded presence, obedience, and deference. What makes these accounts linger isn't just the actions themselves, but the environment that allowed them to continue. Within the royal walls, Andrew's eccentricities were tolerated, even accommodated. Staff learned to tiptoe around irritations. Friends learned to roll their eyes and move on. The outside world rarely heard a whisper. So the habits flourished in the shadows of palaces, private estates, and elite social circles, more willing to shrug than confront. By the time Prince Andrew became an adult public figure, the warning signs were no longer subtle. His treatment of women seemed guided by a single assumption: his feelings came first. If something amused him, everyone else was expected to play along. If something displeased him, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Some recalled sudden mood swings over trivial matters, a misplaced object, a poorly timed comment. Others remembered moments when he behaved as if every room he entered became a stage, and everyone inside became his unwilling audience. The teddy bears, strangely enough, became one of the clearest symbols of this lifelong mindset. They were arranged not out of sentimentality, but control. The laminated card stored in the bedroom drawer wasn't to protect cherished childhood memories. It was an instruction manual for obedience. Staff had to follow it because Andrew expected the world to mirror his preferences exactly. What ties these events together isn't the oddity of each moment, but the consistency behind them. The boy who entered bedrooms uninvited became the man who demanded his toys be arranged like ceremonial relics. The teenager who lectured a stranger in her bathroom grew into the adult who erupted when things didn't look the way he wanted. Decade after decade, the pattern repeated. Boundaries were suggestions, not rules. Settings changed. country estates, royal residences, private suites, but Andrew's behaviour remained the same. And over time, those early stories, once seen as harmless anecdotes, started to look more like warning signs pointing to a larger truth. They revealed a man shaped not by responsibility, but by the steady reinforcement of privilege, someone who mistook indulgence for affection and entitlement for authority. The image of 72 meticulously arranged teddy bears is more than a quirky detail. It's a quiet, unsettling reminder of a life lived inside a bubble where no one ever said no. Even the simplest objects became symbols of a deeper, long-standing pattern, one built on intrusion, expectation, and a belief that the world must always rearrange itself to Prince Andrew's liking. So, if the world always bent to his will, what hidden truths did those closest to the monarchy witness about his untouchable, domineering ways? Shadows lurking behind palace walls, long before rumours hardened into stories. There was already a quiet understanding among those who worked closest to the monarchy. Prince Andrew moved through the world differently, not simply because he was born into privilege, but because he carried himself as though that privilege gave him license to unsettle, embarrass, or dominate anyone who crossed his path. His status as the Queen's favoured son shaped the atmosphere around him, creating a silence that followed him into every room, corridor, and gathering. Staff who served in royal households recall the tension rising whenever his footsteps echoed down a hallway, even in the late 1990s. During weekends at country estates scattered across England, staff whispered warnings to one another, not because they feared mistakes. Mistakes happen in any workplace, but because Prince Andrew reacted as if errors were personal insults. A napkin folded slightly off-centre, a tray delivered a minute too late, and a storm of anger would erupt, directed at young staff barely old enough to have left school. What unsettled many was not just the shouting, but the unpredictability. One moment, Prince Andrew might stroll through a drawing room wearing forced charm. The next, he could turn a harmless interaction into a humiliating spectacle. Former guests and household workers recall these moments with a mix of disbelief, frustration, and resignation, often shaking their heads at how unchecked and bizarre his behaviour could be. They say his antics were never the playful mischief of a man trying to lighten a stiff royal atmosphere. No, these were deliberate demonstrations of power, executed with precision and an unnerving sense of entitlement. At social gatherings, especially in grand country homes between 1995 and 2002, Prince Andrew was notorious for bursting into rooms uninvited, often late at night, disrupting the calm as if he owned every inch of space. Some guests initially assumed harmless curiosity, a misguided attempt to mingle, but the pattern quickly became obvious. Andrew would swing open doors without knocking, scanning the room as though seeking something, or someone, to dominate or humiliate. One woman recalls the uncomfortable moment when he paused in her doorway, assessing her like merchandise on display, and then remarked that he was shopping for entertainment. His tone left no room for objection, and even seasoned courtiers admitted feeling uneasy in his presence. Stories of his so-called jokes circulated quietly among those who spent time near him. At one private dinner, a young woman carried a plate of pâté. Andrew made an exaggerated show of sniffing the air, loudly declaring to the entire room that it smelled awful. When she leaned in to inspect it, he shoved her face toward the plate, laughing as if performing some grand act of comedy. Silence followed. Not confusion, but fear of what might happen if anyone dared challenge him. Witnesses say he thrived on moments of discomfort, lingering with a smug satisfaction that left everyone tense. At another house party, a woman awoke to find Andrew pointing a fire extinguisher directly at her face. Witnesses recall him blasting rooms with it throughout the night, leaving chaos and shrieking guests in his wake. He lingered in doorways, watching reactions with obvious amusement before moving on to the next target, taking pleasure in the disarray and whispered exclamations from frightened staff and guests alike. Younger staff, particularly teenage maids brought from small towns to work in historic residences, often bore the brunt of Andrew's temper. Many were just 18, far from home, and entirely dependent on their income. Andrew seemed aware of this and exploited it. A glass polished imperfectly or a request not completed at impossible speed became enough for him to unleash his authority, while he maintained a veneer of charm and innocence that confused those around him. His sharp, commanding voice would ring through hallways as he dressed them down for errors too minor to justify such cruelty. During weekend gatherings, Andrew introduced games meant to appear light-hearted, but left many feeling trapped. Guests remember being forced into long chains, marching through ornate rooms like a children's parade, their movements dictated entirely by his whim. Other games, such as fruit passing, forced participants to stand uncomfortably close, pushing boundaries under the guise of entertainment. His infamous mustard trick, squeezing mustard under someone's nose while pretending it was an accident, became a ritual repeated every time, his laughter louder than everyone else's, echoing long after the moment had passed. Across years spent in estates, a pattern emerged: humiliation disguised as humour, intrusion masked as sociability, dominance cloaked in rank and privilege. Those who witnessed Andrew's behaviour speak of it not as isolated incidents, but as part of an ongoing atmosphere in which royal protection acted as a shield against consequence. Behind the shimmering facade of royal tradition, these stories reveal something far darker, a sense of entitlement that few dared confront directly and that shaped the culture of every household he entered. Prince Andrew tested limits, not because he could, but because no one was allowed to say he couldn't. Could his unchecked charm really mask a recklessness that would soon leave a mark far beyond palace walls, challenging patience and expectations within the royal corridors, Prince Andrew's privilege, power, and public scandal? Even before the world caught a full glimpse of his antics, Andrew had long carried a reputation for reckless charm within palace corridors. The young prince, often celebrated for his status and connections, sometimes let that privilege slide into carelessness, testing the patience of those around him. By 1981, this tendency would not just irritate courtiers, it would leave an international mark. That year, Andrew was granted a holiday in Egypt, a lavish gesture of royal esteem. President Anwar Sadat himself offered the use of the presidential jet, a move meant to symbolise the respect between nations and the honour due to the British royal family. What should have been a diplomatic triumph soon turned into calamity due to Andrew's behaviour. Reports from the trip paint a vivid picture of excess and impropriety. At one glamorous gathering in Cairo, witnesses described him leaping into a swimming pool, fully clothed, dragging a female guest along, stunning the assembled elite. Laughter followed him, but not everyone shared it. The woman emerged embarrassed before Egyptian high society, while Andrew, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of his actions, treated the incident as a private joke. It was not just poor taste, it was a misstep on the world stage, a reflection of a prince whose private impulses were already spilling into public shame behind closed doors. Palace aides often struggled to manage Andrew's behaviour. His charm and status provided a shield, making it difficult for even senior courtiers to impose limits. As his missteps accumulated, it became clear the prince's recklessness was no longer contained. These moments, whether in high-profile foreign trips or social events closer to home, painted a portrait of someone for whom privilege seemed to excuse consequence. The Cairo incident was far from isolated. Friends, staff, and occasional journalists recounted other episodes blending humour with humiliation, where Andrew's confidence repeatedly overstepped boundaries. Yet each story reinforced a growing tension. The stark contrast between the prince's personal sense of entitlement and the responsibilities inherent to his royal role. Every laugh he provoked abroad carried the weight of national perception. Diplomats and hosts, expecting decorum befitting representatives of the crown, were often left bewildered or mortified. Andrew's behaviour would ripple outward in ways he likely did not foresee. While early incidents were dismissed as youthful indiscretions, the pattern began to chip away at his image. What began as a private struggle with impulse quickly became a public lesson in the fragile line between charm and impropriety. By the time foreign dignitaries shared their recollections, it was no longer anecdote but a diplomatic embarrassment, one that would follow him through reporting and rumour for years. The 1981 Egyptian trip, in particular, became emblematic of Andrew's complicated and often reckless relationship with the world he inhabited. There was wealth, privilege, and access beyond imagination, yet alongside it an absence of restraint that drew attention in all the wrong ways. Laughter at inappropriate moments, pranks that humiliated others, and a disregard for decorum transformed what should have been routine royal visits into cautionary tales. A holiday intended to showcase diplomacy became a stage for unchecked entitlement, a glimpse into a young man who believed rules were optional when it came to his whims. Episodes like these were remembered not for warmth or grace, but for awkward, even shocking moments on the international stage. Reflecting on Andrew's early adult years, a clear pattern emerges. He moved comfortably among power and prestige, yet consistently failed to recognize the weight of his actions or the ripple effects they caused. Each misstep, from playful excess to questionable judgment, revealed the sharp tension at the heart of royal life, the gap between expectation and impulse, responsibility and self-indulgence. While the palace often smoothed over incidents behind closed doors, the wider world eventually glimpsed what insiders already knew. Andrew's behavior was unpredictable, yes, but also profoundly consequential. The fallout from these moments went beyond social embarrassment. They were constant reminders of the fragile nature of reputation, the precarious balance between privilege and accountability. In the years following the Egyptian holiday, Andrew's image would oscillate between public fascination and private concern, his every action scrutinized not only for amusement, but for the way it reflected on the monarchy itself. His actions were examined not just as the behavior of a young man, but as the conduct of a prince whose every move carried weight, visibility, and expectation. In that, the Cairo pool incident and other episodes served as early warning signs, foreshadowing how a life of extraordinary opportunity could be undermined by lapses in judgment, leaving a legacy both remarkable and controversial. But when those closest to Prince Andrew witnessed his true behaviour, the impact on the legacy he hoped to protect was shocking. Tales of arrogance and entitlement abounded. The room seemed to shrink whenever he entered, not because of charm or charisma, but because his presence demanded attention simply by virtue of who he was. Those around him quickly learned that manners, respect, or ordinary human decency were optional when dealing with someone whose world revolved entirely around himself. His behaviour was consistently dismissive, at times shockingly cruel, and always wrapped in a brazen sense of entitlement that left onlookers uneasy, unsure how to respond without risking his wrath. From casual acquaintances to long-time staff, no one was spared the sting of his arrogance. Even the smallest inconveniences became stages for Andrew's privilege. A wayward golf ball rolling into a garden would summon police officers as if the world itself existed solely to serve him. Staff were not colleagues. They were props, expected to anticipate his whims and endure humiliation silently. Social gatherings, dinners, and formal events often turned into uncomfortable exhibitions of power dynamics, where his amusement came at the expense of anyone deemed beneath him. Some incidents became infamous, whispered about in elite circles for decades. In 1992, broadcaster Tanya Breyer endured an episode that would be remembered long afterward. At a society event, Andrew reportedly walked up behind her and unzipped her dress in public. The stunned silence, awkward laughter, and gasps that followed only seemed to fuel his sense of superiority. It was a moment that revealed a profound disregard not only for personal boundaries, but also for basic decency, leaving witnesses shocked and indignant. This pattern repeated itself in subtler yet equally cutting ways. At a dinner in Windsor Castle, he reportedly mocked an 18-year-old secretary, loudly proclaiming her work uninteresting and unworthy of attention. For those watching, it was a display of power wielded purely for amusement, a stark reminder that in Andrew's presence, respect was not earned through effort or merit, but simply by fitting into his narrow definitions of worth. Friends and insiders described sitting beside him as a trial of endurance, where conversation frequently devolved into commentary about women's clothing or trivial private matters, reducing those around him to props for his entertainment. Observers noted that Andrew's behaviour was not impulsive or occasional, it was habitual. Privilege was not simply a circumstance of birth, it was a lens through which he interpreted every interaction. It shaped how he navigated events, engaged with colleagues, and measured amusement. Laughter in the room often came at the cost of someone else's dignity, a cruel calculus where the powerful were entertained and the powerless humiliated. Yet beneath the layers of arrogance lingered a constant obsession with appearances, status, and social rank. Every encounter became an opportunity to assert superiority, to remind those present of his elevated station. Women, in particular, often drew his attention in ways that were intrusive and objectifying, and he rarely faced immediate consequences. It was as if the weight of privilege could shield even the most indefensible acts, leaving behind a trail of discomfort, anger, and whispered stories that echoed through halls and homes alike. A clear pattern emerges. Entitlement exercised without restraint, amusement derived from others' misfortune, and a persistent insistence on being the centre of attention. Incidents like those with Tanya Breyer and the young secretary at Windsor Castle were not isolated lapses, but symptomatic of a broader worldview, one in which rules, manners, and empathy applied unevenly, if at all. The shock and indignation these actions provoked lingered far longer than the laughter they briefly inspired, leaving many to wonder how such behaviour could be tolerated, excused, or even normalised within elite circles. Ultimately, the portrait that emerges is of a man defined as much by arrogance as by privilege. From trivial demands to moments of outright cruelty, the pattern is unmistakable. Prince Andrew was accustomed to getting his way, for whom boundaries, empathy, and discretion were inconveniences rather than guiding principles. In recounting these episodes, it becomes clear that the spectacle of entitlement left lasting impressions, not merely because of what he did, but because of the culture of acquiescence that allowed it, and the people who endured it, often in silence, as the world watched on. Even now, decades later, these stories continue to surface. Whispered among social circles or recounted in memoirs, they remind us that the shadow of privilege can stretch far beyond the walls of palaces and private estates. For those who encountered Prince Andrew, the memory is often uncomfortable, sometimes infuriating, but always indelible, a testament to the power dynamics and unchecked entitlement that shaped both his life and the lives of those around him. So how did unchecked entitlement allow Prince Andrew to navigate power with impunity, affecting everyone in his orbit, in ways few could have imagined when entitlement meets consequence? For decades, Andrew moved through the corridors of power with a sense of untouchable freedom, inhabiting a world where privilege masked behaviour that would have unsettled any ordinary person. Those around him, staff, acquaintances, and the young women drawn into his orbit, quickly learned that his charm could turn sharp, and his so-called jokes were rarely harmless. They were deliberate, calculated, and humiliating. Observers, like author Andrew Looney, described his antics not as the harmless eccentricities of royalty, but as carefully staged acts meant to provoke, dominate, and display a blend of juvenile mischief and brazen entitlement. It wasn't mischief. It was a weapon. Accounts paint a vivid portrait of a man accustomed to having the world bend around him, a man emboldened by the protective walls of the monarchy. Complaints were dismissed or quietly silenced, creating a pattern that seemed untouchable over 4 decades. Staff feared reprisal, witnesses were ignored, and the illusions of consequence simply did not exist. This was a world where power shielded wrongdoing, where audacity thrived under the veneer of aristocracy. Jeffrey Epstein, whose name would forever be entwined with scandal, once referred to Andrew as more perverted than I am, dubbing him the King of Kink, a description that shocked some and confirmed the darkest suspicions of others. Yet, for all his audacity, the protective bubble surrounding Andrew was fragile, and cracks were forming. November 6th, a date now etched in modern royal history, marked a turning point. King Charles, with decisive authority, stripped Andrew of all military affiliations and royal patronages. The gesture wasn't symbolic alone. It was a formal acknowledgement that decades of privilege could no longer shield misconduct. It was a public reckoning, a declaration that entitlement has its limits, and that the walls of royalty could not contain every misdeed. The revelations themselves are staggering. Stories recounting Andrew's treatment of staff and young women reveal a consistent pattern. Humiliation as entertainment, exploitation as routine, a hierarchy where his whims superseded ethics. Many observers noted a disturbing casualness in how he wielded power, with every intrusion seeming almost normalized behind closed doors. What might appear on the surface as eccentric or awkward often carried a sinister undertone. Staff members were caught between fear and loyalty. Witnesses who might have spoken up faced an impenetrable web of intimidation and social consequence. Every ignored complaint, every brushed-off allegation reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. The public, now seeing the culmination of years of quiet whispers and half-heard rumours, is left grappling with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. How could a member of one of the most scrutinised families in history operate for so long with apparent impunity? The truth lies partly in the systemic protections that surrounded him. The monarchy's inclination to preserve reputation over accountability, the palace's implicit tolerance, created an environment where arrogance and entitlement were nurtured. Andrew was free to humiliate, intimidate, and exploit, safe in the belief that consequences were a distant abstraction. Yet November 6th shattered that illusion. The stripping of titles was not merely punitive, it was emblematic. It communicated that history would not remain silent, that documentation and testimony could outweigh privilege. And while Andrew's actions had been recorded, reported, and sometimes whispered about in hushed tones for decades, the palace's inaction had enabled the continuation of those behaviours for far too long. The world could finally see that what appeared as arrogance or eccentricity was in fact a deeply rooted pattern of entitlement with real-world consequences for everyone in his orbit. The broader implications are profound, raising questions about why more witnesses did not step forward sooner and why the mechanisms designed to protect the vulnerable were so slow to act. Every account of Andrew's misconduct, every humiliation inflicted in private quarters, points to an almost systemic failure, a combination of fear, power, and centuries-old traditions. Yet the public reckoning now forces reflection. The walls of privilege can crumble, and even centuries-old institutions are not immune to scrutiny. Andrew's story is not just a chronicle of one man's excesses, but a cautionary tale about unchecked power and entitlement. No matter how gilded, it cannot remain invisible forever. The humiliations, the silent complaints, and the carefully maintained illusion of untouchability all converged into a moment when consequence finally arrived. And while some may still wonder what might have been prevented had action come sooner, the stripping of titles on November 6th marks a definitive statement. Privilege does not excuse cruelty, and history remembers. Now the question looms over the future. Will others step forward, emboldened by this moment? Or will silence continue to shield the powerful? The narrative of Andrew's entitlement is a stark reminder that even the most protected lives are subject to the reckoning of time. Truth and public scrutiny in the modern era matter. Power may shield for a while, but consequences, once set in motion, can be unstoppable. So what do you think made Andrew believe he could humiliate and control everyone at his parties for decades? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and share.